So now turning to my paper, how can policies affecting trade and markets help achieve SDG 2.4, that is to say, sustainable food production and resilient agricultural practices? It is fair to say that at this point of time, my presentation will contain more questions than answers. I think we are faced with a unique challenge, and in terms of the degree of the unsustainability of the food system, and it's worth recognizing that we have more questions than answers at this stage. Now, starting with the basic facts here, we have a very unsustainable food system in terms of production. If you look at the planetary boundaries framework, it clearly shows that all areas of increasing or high risk directly relate to agricultural production and the food system. First, we have biochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen. Agriculture is by large the main user of phosphorus globally, accounting for between 80 to 90% of total world demand. Human activities now convert more atmospheric nitrogen into reactive forms than all the Earth's terrestrial processes combined. Agriculture is also a key driver of change in the biosphere integrity, especially genetic diversity. As we know, traded crops are very limited in terms of their genetic diversity. Climate change, with a rise in GHG emissions coming from agriculture and land use, and obviously land system change, including land conversion. On the consumption side, the picture is also quite challenging. We have obviously imbalances in food consumption with an increase in food-related illnesses and continued hunger and malnutrition. We also have a strong correlation between affluence, changing diets, and increased material footprint of nutrition. This means we have a projected total calorie consumption increase, and within that, a higher share of resource-intensive products. And you can see on the side this very useful double pyramid, which shows on the left-hand corner what you should be eating to improve your health and diet, and on the right side, the environmental impact of various types of food. There is also the issue of food and beverage packaging, which constitutes half of all packaging uses, with major impact on total plastic consumption, which of course, comes from fossil fuels, but also on plastic litter, which has major impact on the world's environment today. The debate around pathways to sustainable production and consumption is quite a difficult one. There is no consensus in the scientific community about how much increase in agricultural production is needed to feed the world and where. There are uncertainties about productivity trends, especially in a warming climate, acrimonious debates around agricultural models, healthy diets, and the debate between efficiency versus sufficiency. There are also dilemmas between competing environmental threats. For instance, if you want to address climate change, but you ignore biodiversity, you might create severe problems in terms of biodiversity, for instance, depending on how you manage forestry. There are also dilemmas about how best to close the nutrient cycle versus greenhouse gas emissions, specifically the role of ruminants within that, and debates around energy versus food in terms of biofuels. Another debate which is very strong in the UNFCCC is the distribution of the effort within and among countries. There is also a question about the interdependencies between national and regional pathways. Obviously, if the European Union were to reduce its overall level of production, if you have been business as usual in terms of consumption and therefore increase imports, the net environmental impact could be positive or negative depending where this additional production is coming from and how it has been produced. Finally, you have uncertainty about what would be the most effective policy levers and their combination: supply versus demand side, market versus non-market. And you see here that I've put a picture that talks about livestock, and I think one of the most difficult issues will be around the role of livestock within those pathways. So within that, what role for trade and investment? To me, what we have is a major contrast between the reality of a globalized food system with a number of export and import dependent countries, and this is not going to go away, a changing composition of trade with more weight in high value products. Certainly that's very important for the European Union. The size of the upstream and downstream trade and services, which is not always talked about, but which is also quite globalized, and obviously increasingly globalized food chain supplies. And this is contrasting with continued high level of trade and investment protection, a very polarized debates about the benefits and downsides of trade and investment liberalization on environmental sustainability. And I think this is both the case in terms of the evidence and the research arena, but also, and very importantly, in the political arena. And I think it's fair to say that there is no silver bullet about how to internalize environmental costs of agricultural production. For instance, how can we remunerate farmers for environmental services while those services are not factored into farm gate prices of products within a competitive and globalized setting? So what are the issues for discussions? And I would very much welcome your feedback here. In terms of tariffs, is there something that could be done in the environmental goods and services negotiations that would benefit specifically SDG 2.4 by looking at agricultural products and services? Subsidies, to me, this is a very big issue. We have a system in the WTO that mostly focuses on trade distortions, and obviously one should look at the elimination of environmentally harmful direct and indirect subsidies. And to be maybe controversial, we could even think about a peace clause for trade distorting subsidies that would be conducive to environmental protection. There's a debate out there whether any trade distorting subsidy is truly conducive to environmental protection and whether there might be more effective tools, but I think it's still worth asking this question. Trade defense, what use for anti-dumping and countervailing duties? It's interesting to see, for instance, that in the EU, there is now in the new proposals around trade defense, some references to environmental dumping. Carbon pricing and taxes. As you know, there are carbon pricing systems, and there is a discussion about harmonizing them and linking them together. But an equally interesting debate is, because it currently does not cover agricultural emissions or carbon sinks from agriculture, whether and how this could be extended to agriculture, and whether this is the right way to go, knowing the current shortcomings of the system, which do not provide for a carbon price that results in the outcomes we're looking for in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. International transportation, so very important to look at what's going on in the International Maritime Organization and also in ICAO in terms of aviations, as a lot of the trade is based on the fact that the price signals from international transportation are not the correct ones because they do not take into account the environmental impacts of international transportation. Sustainability Adjustment Fund. Should we use development assistance to ensure a just transition? As we know, a very big difficulty within any discussion about pathways is who will bear the costs and who should get supported within any given geographical setting, whether it's local, national, regional, or global. So how can we ensure a just transition and avoid backlash because of the distributional impacts of changes in policy? Other issues for discussions, obviously Article 20, allows for certain exemptions. There is no primacy of trade, but in practice it's not being operationalized and not being used properly. So is there something that could be done there? Trade restrictions and bans of environmentally unsustainable products and inputs. For instance, we know that some chemicals have very detrimental effects on biodiversity. There's more controversy about whether they have an impact on health, but at least in terms of biodiversity, the evidence is very clear. Could we see the potential for trade restrictions for those products and inputs? Voluntary sustainability schemes for resource-intensive products and sectors, building really on existing experience around, palm oil or timber or other sectors. Harmonization of or co-creation of new standards. Certainly coming here from the European Union, there's a big focus now on circular economy standards, and what could think, for instance, of thinking about eco-design in packaging for food, which would have a major impact worldwide in terms of the environmental costs of the food system. Technology transfer and IP flexibilities to improve access to greener technologies. We have a limited amount of time to turn the system around. And obviously that means that every farmer should have access to the greenest technology possible, and issues of intellectual property and prices should not get in the way. Finally, green public procurement. Public procurement in terms of food is a major driver in terms of agricultural systems. Could we restart pre-lateral discussion among interested parties to look at how green public procurement could be part of the solution? To finish, a few more concrete and specific proposals. I think there is still the need to close the knowledge gap on pathways to sustainable food consumption and production and the role of trade within it. So more work to be done with the FAO and the OECD, but also, possibly linking more with other science bodies like the IPCC. There's a need for mainstreaming trade into the agricultural track of the UNFCCC. This agricultural track, after being blocked for many years, is slowly starting. And obviously trade is thought to be a highly controversial issue within the UNFCCC, but it would be hard to see how we can make meaningful progress and find meaningful solutions without talking about the trade issues as part of the work program of this agricultural negotiation track. And maybe to start with a confidence building mechanism using the G20 agricultural ministers process to start talking about those very hot issues on agriculture and climate change would be a good way to go. Another idea would be to have an independent trade and SDGs commission under the aegis of the WTO, with a potential focus on how best to implement the Paris Agreement and a reaction to the new IPCC reports, which will come out in the second half of 2018. Finally, could we use RTA negotiation and commercial diplomacies to explore options around incentivizing sustainability? We have, for instance, the precedent of the EU-Chile agreement on organic products. Do those provisions, are they actually effective? And if so, can they be replicated elsewhere? I thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much to your comments at the conference or on social media by writing to me. You can see my email address here. Thank you very much.